is Cathy Herbrand, and I will be chairing today's symposium with my colleague Kylie Baldwin. We both are based at the Center for Reproduction Research at the Montfort University, and we've been convening this study group for the past few years. So I first wanted to thank you to attend a symposium today. Of course, would have preferred to welcome you at DMU like the previous years and get to know you and exchange about the works in person with a regular bunch of cookies and nibbles at hand. But hopefully this will be the case again next year. In the meantime, and after having had to cancel last year's conference, we're delighted to be able to organize this online symposium on the reproductive challenges in post-COVID-19 world. About a year after the start of the first lockdown, we thought that this event would be a great opportunity to touch base and consider how this major social, health, and economic crisis has affected and still affects reproduction in a broad sense, with respect to fertility trends, individual reproductive decision-making, maternity care, but also reproduction studies themselves by modifying methods to collect data, challenging the way we recruit participants and who we recruit, but also more fundamentally questioning a research ethics and the purposes of why and for whom we're conducting research. So we're extremely pleased to have the chance to discuss these issues with three exceptional speakers today who will tell us a bit more about the recent work in this area. So Wahlberg, Charlotte Faircloth, and Mary Greenfield. So before I introduce them in more detail, I just wanted to say a few words about the Center for Reproduction Research. So we are an interdisciplinary center dedicated to improve understanding about reproductive health and access to reproductive care. So we are quite a big team now, like with people from different backgrounds, and we've been conducting research on a broad range of topics. We welcome PhD students and research visitors. So if you're interested in reproductive studies, just get in touch. You can also know more about the work and events if you join a mailing list. And you'll find on the webpage. So before starting, just a little bit of housekeeping. So there will be 10 to 15 minutes after each presentation to ask questions. And we really would like to encourage you to unmute yourself and switch your camera on when asking questions to the speaker. So we make things a bit more interactive and lively. Thank you for that. But if you can, there's also a chat box where you can write your question and we'll try and take them after the talk. In the meantime, please keep your microphone and camera off to help with the connection. And for information, the session will be recorded, as you can see, and the recorded will be made available to the attendees in the coming days. So now I'll hand it over to you, Kylie, to introduce a keynote speaker today, Wahlberg.
Thank you, Cathy. And just to kind of second what Cathy says, we would love to be doing this face-to-face. We very much love running the BSA Human Reproduction Study Group and the opportunities it gives us to bring people together and to meet everyone and to learn what everyone does. And I hope that we'll be able to return to the format that we've run for many years now through DMU, the multi-streamed annual conference where we get to hear all about your research. And I think that's something we'll look forward to doing as and when we can in the future. But in between times, we're really glad to be able to use this online medium to be able to run events of this kind and get to speak to people, looking at our delegate list, you know, in lots of different countries by the looks of things, as well as, of course, having people coming from overseas without having to incur any of their existing cost or having to ask them to travel very far. So I suppose this has its benefits. So to that end, I'll introduce our first speaker and our plenary speaker, Wahlberg. He may be known to many of you, I imagine is the case. He is professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Copenhagen, and he's the author of the award-winning book monograph, Good Quality, The Routinization of Sperm Banking in China, which was published by University of California Press. Many of you might be aware of that book. And he's also the co-editor more recently of the Selective Reproduction in the 21st Century book from Palgrave. He works broadly in the fields of social studies of biomedicine, and his research broadly focuses, or has in the past focused on traditional herbal medicines in Vietnam and in the United Kingdom, but again, more recently on the selective reproductive technologies in China and Denmark, as well as health metrics. I've been recently working on a very interesting sounding ESRC research project on the vitality of disease, the quality of life in the making, which has been examining the ways in which patients and carers are increasingly taught, trained or advised on how best to live with their disease. But of course, the topic of his talk today is slightly different to that. It's an area of research that I think has been really very interesting to look at. So I'm looking forward to hearing your talk today, Ayo. I'll just be doing the chairing for you, and then we'll open it up to questions. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie, and the usual share screen pause here. And first of all, I still can't get used to, jumping into a Zoom room and then seeing all these wonderful, good friends from all over the world. It's like magic. It really is. There we go. So first of all, let me start by saying thank you, of course, to Kylie for the kind introduction, but also to Cathy for the invitation, but in fact, indeed, to the entire team at the Montfort University Center for Reproduction and Research, which we just heard about. It's truly an honor, and I'm really, really sad that we can't do this in real life, because coming to Leicester has been at the top of my agenda for such a long time. Given the Center for Reproduction Research really is one of the kind of centers of gravity when it comes to social studies of reproduction. It would have been a true honor and pleasure to have been there as well. But here we are, and hopefully in the near future we will be able to do so. And it's a particular honor to be speaking at this specific summer event on reproductive challenges in a post-COVID-19 world, because I think, like all of us in the room here, basically whatever we were doing came to be COVID-19 inflected. And basically this is research that I'm hoping to secure together with some colleagues funding for relatively soon. So it's still a kind of work in progress in terms of developing ideas, but we had to modify the application or the applications because, of course, of the unfolding pandemic. So that's what I'll be sharing with you. And of course, another thing I just wanted to flag, the CRR has, of course, been, especially Christina Weiss, has been kind of keeping us up to date with the COVID-19 and reproduction digest. So I think this is really a fitting setting for our discussions today, because I think that blog has really been fantastic, a fantastic resource, and I continue to use it. So thanks so much for that. All right, I will speak for, I think, about 35 minutes. I've timed it, so I'm hoping to leave very good time for discussion afterwards. So let me just jump into things. Very first, as said, we are working together with Charlotte and Janne on some funding for research. So I want to acknowledge both of them right off the bat, because they have been such a crucial conversation partner in terms of the talk I'll be giving today. And not least, many of you are here attending the amazing Changing Infertilities Network. We've been meeting through the years by now, and I mean, all of the thinking that I have been done is basically, I owe so much to the network and so many of you who are attending today. So thank you to all of you beforehand. Well, I've shown this slide before, and I don't think it's any news to the people in this room, but I don't think a day goes by without these kinds of headlines. I mean, it's quite striking. Maybe it's because I'm working on it, but and when you work on something, you notice it. But honestly, almost on a daily basis, we're seeing these kinds of headlines, and it's a global phenomenon. Of course, we know that there are parts of the world which are still problematized, if we could use that word, in terms of demography, in terms of family planning, as having too high a fertility. But basically everywhere in the world, wherever we are, fertility rates are falling. They may be falling from a high rate to begin with in kind of demographic terms, or they may already be at a low rate and falling even further. But the trend is absolutely global by now. And then, of course, as we know, and very pertinent to our discussions today, COVID-19 hits about 1.5 years ago, and immediately almost we started seeing those kind of almost, you know, to begin with, kind of jokes about, well, we'll probably be seeing a huge baby boom because people are at home and having time. And those then gradually, of course, turned into more serious, you know, research questions in terms of looking at, well, what is actually going to be happening to reproduction, not just in terms of booms and busts, but also reproductive health, pregnancy. And again, we'll be hearing a lot about that today from our speakers. So I'll be really focusing on this question of fertility decline and asking how COVID-19 is inflecting a trend that was already there. And obviously the jury's still out. The headlines, as always, tend to kind of sensationalize, you could say, and look for the big story, but the jury's still out because, as we know, there's always a lag and a delay. And in fact, I'm originally from Finland. I think I saw a few of my friends from Finland here. This has been a big debate in Finland, not least because of an experienced decline in recent years. And the last I checked, actually, it might be that Finland may indeed have a bit of a boom. So I don't think the conclusions are clear at this stage, but there's no question that part of the effects of COVID-19 have been cast in terms of these kinds of consequences. And again, not just on the question of whether to have a baby or not least in terms of the health consequences for those who might have been expecting or indeed given birth during the lockdown. So today's talk, what I want to do is to, as I kind of sketch out in the abstract as well, is to address this question of why are fertility rates falling. And let it be no secret, and if we look at the gender composition of those attending today, I will be saying quite a lot of, sharing quite a lot of my views on this question when it comes to where, quite frankly, the blame is being placed when we ask this question of why are fertility rates falling. I'm not going to be attending to this question of the consequences. There are a lot of, you know, projected consequences. And indeed, I'm not going to be talking about whether it's a good or bad thing. That's also a contested question, but I'm happy to discuss that after the talk. And what I want to do is propose, and this is a term that together with Charlotte and Janne, we're developing currently, the notion of fertility forms as perhaps an alternative way to address this question of falling fertility. And those are some of the headlines under there that I will be covering. And basically, it's an argument that we're developing to move kind of beyond biology and choice as some of the prime ways of addressing falling fertility. So these are, if we look, let me just shift my screen so that I can see all the text here. So if we look at the explanations that are circulating currently among demographers, among biologists, reproductive scientists, basically, as we can see, women, females are highlighted as not necessarily because they are to blame as such, but there's no question that the ways in which one explains falling fertility is female-centric, let's put it like that. That's the most diplomatic way I can put it. And basically, you know, on the biological side, as we know, the so-called fertility cliff, delaying of childbearing, it's pointed out it has a role, and it's often cast as this question of how women decide to continue their schooling, to acquire a profession before even thinking of having children. Likewise, rising individualism is also kind of highlighted as a you know, almost a sociological state of modernity or post-modernity. And once again, high proportions of never married and childless women are kind of singled out, although tempered by suggestions that there's been slow institutional adaptation to the changing, rapid changes in, lo and behold, women's status, continued trends in female educational attainment and access to contraception. I mean, honestly, what were women thinking, right? I mean, the last two bullet points are basically the caveat, in the sense that here, because we live in a toxic world, because we live in a climate change threatened world, there it doesn't necessarily become gendered in the same way, because we all know the widespread kind of account of falling sperm, which remains contested, but is getting a lot of airtime. But also endocrine disruption as something that affects both male and female reproductive development. So there are explanations out there which have to do with biology, which are much more centered around basically the kind of eco-reproductive concerns, as it's put in the final kind of bullet there. But still, this idea of for some, reproductive choice. So we're concerned about the future, so perhaps we're not going to have children as a result. And then, of course, if we live in a toxic world, we cannot avoid but perhaps being impacted by the chemicals that we're surrounded by. So these are some of the prevailing ways of explaining falling fertility. Now, what we want to do in this work around fertility forms is to perhaps return to some of these classic anthropological key questions that, of course, Sarah Franklin, of course, very famously did in Embodied Progress as well, but not so much to kind of address that, all those important debates about the facts of human reproduction, the facts of life, but rather to ask this question of whether kinship in its kind of original iteration, if we could put it like that, which was seen as this kind of organizing kind of classificatory system when it came to, let's call them small scale societies based in, villages, rural areas and the like. If we look at the first generation of British sociology, especially, but, structural functionalism in particular, the kinship system was really the kind of perhaps one of the, or not perhaps, one of the kind of core systems that it was the task of the ethnographer to kind of map out. And that was not just because, for biological reasons. It was because, as Rivers points out, the way in which we, the privileges, the restrictions, the duties that we have are very often linked to the kinds of relations that we have to our kin, so to say. And as Macaretti puts it, knowing who your relations are and how you are related to them was very, very kind of particularly important to the organization of social life. So social organization was a matter of kinship. This is really at the level of the small scale, so to say. So fertility forums for us is really trying to perhaps lift the scale here from the small scale, because obviously kinship, as we know, continues to play a crucial, important role in societies around the world. But fertility forums operates as a concept more at this demographic level. And, perhaps my time working in China has been kind of shaping that kind of thinking as well. But yeah, just to, I already mentioned this, but we all know, of course, Sarah's pioneering amazing work where, in the original anthropological debates, the whole idea of a kinship system came to be wound up in this question of the biological facts of human reproduction, which was somehow the solid kind of truth behind the system, in a sense, and all those debates that she kind of covers in the first chapter of Embodied Progress. Now, as we know, and again, many of you in the room here have been participating in this kind of work, we know that infertility, social studies of infertility have really shown us how these yearnings for conformity, as Sarah has put it, the demands of peer pressure, expectations of in-laws, the yearnings for alignment with institutional norms, gender conformity and the like, that it's not a choice in a sense to pursue infertility treatment for many because of these pressures, right? So this very important argument that Sarah has developed, and by now we've seen these patterns play out across the world, as she points out in Biological Relatives, whether in India, China, Ecuador, so many anthropological studies have kind of seen these patterns, of course, in different cultural configurations, but seen these patterns. Now, these pressures, expectations, social conformity, pressures of social conformity, norm alignment notwithstanding, fertility rates are falling. So this is the kind of puzzle, in a sense, that we are asking ourselves. So we know that there are all these expectations, but still fertility rates are falling. And we're, as you've probably guessed by now, not necessarily convinced that rising individualism and biological causes are the way in which we should explain what's happening here. So we're literally trying to invert this question and to formulate in a different way. So what kinds of societies, what forms of social organization configure what demographers tend to call low fertility? So it's really flipping it on its head, taking the focus away from our biological bodies and these ideas that we have a choice in these kinds of matters. So for us, in the way we're thinking right now, fertility forms are socio-historically, economically, legally, and culturally shaped reproductive configurations that generate what we're thinking of as demographic figures. On the one hand, forms of reproductive citizenship that many, again, scholars in this room have been researching as well. And also, finally, a kind of what we are thinking of in terms of stratified livability. And I'll return to each of these in the remainder of the talk. And just to, acknowledge that hugely inspired, not just because I've worked in China, but just because of her, amazing contributions to social studies of fertility and reproduction. Susan Greenhalgh's, very, very early article on the political economy of fertility, stands for me as definitely one of the landmark kind of articles, and very much inspired by her work here. So what are demographic figures? If you attended the 4S, was it last summer? Yeah, I presented a paper on demographic figures, making the case that demographic figures emerge as these kind of quantified demographic changes, which demographers, publish, and they get into the newspapers and so forth. These figures, these literally numerical figures, come to be personified and stereotyped in all kinds of speculations about the future. It's often crisis related, demographic crisis related. And these figures, again, figures in the kind of cultural sense of figures, they circulate through news media, social media, art, and scholarship. And I'm sure as soon as I say this, every one of you can kind of conjure up one of these images in your head, just from, because we all work in this field, but also just from reading newspapers. And so in China, where I work, have worked for the last many years, one of the kind of iconic by now figures, demographic figures, is this so-called very derogatory label of the shengnu, the leftover women. And these are very often urban-based, professional, the usual stereotype here. And I think we have a version of this stereotype regardless of where we are in the world. But in China, they have been given this this very, very kind of derogatory label, at least in kind of popular media, if not also in semi-official kind of family planning documents. And basic idea being that they're so busy looking after their lives and they are not getting married, and they're not living up to their filial obligations, and they have a lot of pressures from, as this kind of blog post indicates, a lot of pressures from their parents and family members, especially when they return home for the Chinese New Year. And versions of this returning to visit your family during Christmas in our parts of the world and so forth, is very important, I think, in this specific demographic figure. Now in China, of course, there's the other side, so to say, of the equation. There's the guangun, the so-called bare branches, again, another derogatory kind of term that has been used to label the kind of dearth of women. So the so-called missing women, demographically speaking, have led to a huge group of men, and it's really kicking in right now in a demographic sense, who literally will not be able to find, for sheer numbers, someone that they might, get to know and perhaps settle down with and get married to. And there's a socioeconomic dimension to this because of, well, all the kinds of stratifications that we'll return to later on. So Guangun and Shengnu are two of the kind of iconic demographic figures that we know from China. I'm not going to go into details, globally, obviously, but I will just throw up a few here. There are countless of these kinds of images that are circulating, and in the egg freezers, of course, have gained in certain kinds of ways a similar kind of, let's say, kind of iconic in the sense of cultural studies, iconic status. They circulate, there's stories, there's kind of blog posts and the like. And again, Kylie's work, so many people here have contributed to our knowledge of the factors that we should be focusing on when it comes to these phenomena. And this is a Danish newspaper article on so-called gamle mødre, so elder mothers, yet another demographic figure who very often kind of demonized, but sort of celebrated as well, but definitely problematized when it comes to this question of falling fertility, because as we know, they are often seen as demanding of or requiring in these kinds of ways in which they're portrayed, demanding of IVF services, which is expensive for a system. And they had put their own lives and selfish pursuits of professions ahead of their desires to have children, kind of thing. So demographic figures are one aspect of the fertility forms, and each country, we suggest and we hope to research more, have their versions of these demographic figures, is our suggestion. Reproductive citizenship is a kind of second arena area that we will be focusing. Now, I forgot to mention that when it comes to the demographic figures, of course, COVID-19, the generation, the lost generation in quotation marks, all kinds of labels are being also put on this group of young people who are growing up under lockdown and so forth. We will see what kind of demographic figures might arise from COVID-19. I think there are probably a few ones taking shape as we speak. Reproductive citizenship, a theme that, of course, many scholars have been working on through the years. And we are very much inspired, not least by Amy Salmons, but also Charlotte Kohliges and her colleague Carol's work, where on the one hand, we have, the kind of, let's say, natalist campaigns, whether it's antinatalism or pronatalism, so state-led natalist campaigns, which perpetuate certain kinds of discourses. And Amy Salmon, of course, famously has looked at these moral panics that have surrounded Aboriginal mothering discourses in Australia. And as she puts it, activations of moral panic in which an identifiable group or behavior comes to stand as a signifier of generalized social crisis and is represented by hegemonic institutions as threatening or antagonistic to the morals, values, or interests of society as a whole. So reproductive citizenship, of course, has to do with the formation of responsible behavior, if you could put it, as I would, given my kind of theoretical inclinations as well, and indeed as Carol and Krolige put it in their work on responsible reproductive citizenship. So in China, you will most likely have heard of the efforts to kind of ease the one-child policy into two-child policy. And that's ongoing, and many scholars and perhaps also by now government officials are saying, well, we might as well just get rid of any kind of policy because people in China are just not having babies at this point in time for all kinds of complex reasons. And as Professor Mu Guangzhong from Peking University puts it here, in an era of low fertility willingness and high birth costs, fertility is not only a personal matter, but also a major event that affects the country's long-term stability. So it's these kind of linkages to society as a whole, the nation, that reproductive citizenship speaks to. So China urgently needs to build a unified policy that is population friendly, fertility friendly, child friendly, family friendly, and elderly friendly. And what really kind of gets to me is that as the Chinese government gradually shifts from its very anti-natalist, the last 40 years to this more pro-natalist mode, the devastation that was caused by the one-child policy in terms of first forced abortions, forced sterilizations, the damage. And those women, those families, they're still around now. And for them to, be living through a time where that government, that state policy, which, did so much damage to their lives, now is actually suggesting, well, get busy, start having babies. Well, I'll kind of leave it there as a thought. So these kinds of campaigns have so many human consequences. And once again, Susan Greenhalgh has done some amazing work there. I'll just throw in a few other kind of global examples here, which are circulating and have been. So in Norway, in the Prime Minister's speech from the 1st of January 2019, her New Year's speech, she speaks to this burden of the welfare state. So if we don't have young people, we won't be able to finance the welfare state that Scandinavians are so committed to and proud of in so many ways. So in the coming decades, she says, we will encounter problems with our social welfare model. To maintain our population, we need to have a little over 2 children each on average. Today, that number is 1.6. There will be fewer young people to bear the increasingly heavy burden of the welfare state. Norway needs more children. I don't think I need to tell anyone how this is done, and I won't be mandating either. Well, not everyone are able to have children or want children for different reasons, and more are waiting longer to have children, also for different reasons. But if you wait too long, it gets more difficult. So a growing number of children are brought into the world with the help of the healthcare system. So we have to ask ourselves, is it too difficult to have children at an earlier age? So here we have at least an acknowledgement that there might be some difficulties involved here, but in terms of reproductive citizenship, the message is clear. Get started as quickly as possible, and very often the connotations and consequences are gendered. In Eastern Europe, Russia, we also see recent pro-natalist kind of movements here. Again, in a New Year's speech, Vladimir Putin in January 2020 says, and this is just before COVID obviously breaks out, we have entered a very difficult demographic period. The birth rate is falling again. The aggregate birth rate was only 1.5 in 2019. Is this few or many is not enough for our country? And more ominously, which really speaks to some of the disturbing currents in our times, not least in Europe, if we want Hungarian children instead of immigrants, then the only solution is to spend as much funds as possible on supporting families and raising children. This is what Viktor Orban said on announcing that the state would be providing free fertility treatment also in January 2020. So these kind of pro-natalist pushes are really starting to rear their heads. They're resurfacing in a sense, you could say, but certainly starting to take shape. And then finally, this is the last kind of area that I will cover before opening up for discussion, stratified livability. So in a book that should be coming out hopefully soon, together with Lenora Manderson, Nancy Burke, it was an amazing kind of project because we reached out basically to our networks around the world and asked people to basically contribute work on how their work was all of a sudden, reshaped by COVID-19. So very much speaking to the theme of today's summer event. Well, I won't go into details. I wish I could, but look out for it. I think there's like 35, 36 chapters from all over the world, and just disturbing ethnographic accounts of the effects of not just the virus itself, but perhaps especially the efforts to contain it in the form of lockdown. And in our introduction to the books, and speaking to the title of the book, we suggest that the effects of the pandemic, and many others have done so as well, but we kind of reiterate here, the effects of the pandemic and of efforts to contain it continue to be unevenly experienced in racialized, disabling, and discriminatory ways. In these ways, the COVID-19 pandemic has loaded onto, compounded, and complicated already existing socioeconomic inequalities, racial discrimination, and uneven access to healthcare, exacerbating what we call stratified livability. And this is certainly the case if we look not just at COVID-19's effect on reproduction, but just in general, this idea of fertility forms that we're trying to think with. Some of you may have attended the amazing annual lecture at the Reproductive in Cambridge, or it was online, but it was organized by our friends in Cambridge by France Windance Twine, where she spoke of incarceration and structural infertility, what she kind of called structural infertility, really focusing on how, because of the carceral structures in the US, the women most likely to be sterilized and indeed suffer from both physical abuse and medical neglect are Latino, Hispanic, Black, Native American, and very often, especially historically speaking, but even up to recent history, have been sterilized through hysterectomies without consent. And just in general, this carceralization of and the fact that this sheer scale of incarceration and its racialized kind of profile, in a sense, is exactly what stratified livability speaks to. And she proposed this notion of a fertility continuum, whereby some women are deemed eligible for parenthood while other women are not. And this is really something that speaks to this kind of the tensions that arise between, on the one hand, so-called pronatalism, and then, you know, the clear by now insights and knowledge that we have that pronatalism is not for everyone. It is very particularly targeted at certain segments, and I think her talk really, really powerfully spoke to this. Changing family forms. We know, again, a lot of scholars in this room have contributed to this literature here. Young women and men are having trouble finding a partner, not to mention various forms of so-called rainbow families that have trouble coming into being because of legal difficulties. We know that dating and marriage patterns are changing all around the world. Long working hours and labor migration are keeping partners apart. There's a certain small family size preference, at least in China, that Li Hongshi has documented. This kind of reliance on grandparents for childcare, especially in countries where childcare is prohibitively expensive, lead to what has been described as intergenerational parenting coalitions by Jing and Suzanne Gottschalk, and of course the increasing costs of childcare and education in general. All these things are kind of contributing in so many ways, in stratified ways, to these changing family forms. And I've shown this slide before in some other talks, but this was kind of one of those shit storms, as they call them, so elegantly, that surrounded Jack Ma, the Alibaba CEO, who said, you should feel honored to work 9 hours a day, from 9 to 9 every day. So that's 12 hours, 6 days a week. You should be honored. That's why would you be worried about that? That's bliss, right? And as one social media user in China kind of responded, if all enterprises enforce a 996 schedule, no one will have children. Speaking again to these stratified forms of livability and indeed reproductibility. And again, Sharmila Rudrapa, some of you may have heard her give this amazing talk on her study of IT workers. I don't think it's published yet. I do hope it's on its way. But she spoke with IT workers in Hyderabad and kind of in an unintended way found out that what they were suffering from, many of them who wanted to have children, was not was what she ended up coining or calling unintended fertility. So individuals and couples who initially do not face fertility challenges, but over their life course find themselves in situations that lead them into making decisions that lead to subsequent medically indicated infertility, and how labor markets and fertility decision-making are intertwined. So I think this really speaks to an aspect of falling fertility, which is not captured by suggestions that people are making career choices and selfishly individualized, looking for self-fulfillment in a sense before they start forming families. And indeed, as I mentioned just before, Li Hongxi has shown how a leading-edge social force that fosters China's recent fertility decline is the pursuit of a modern family and successful child rearing achieved through having a small family. So the small family size has kind of come to stay in China for financial reasons, but also because having just one child, in a sense, gives you resources to pursue the kinds of good lives that many people aspire to in the sense of middle class standards of living. And then very finally here, in an amazing special issue, Jing Song and Ying Shunji have made this point: there has been a tension between growing opportunities for women outside the family and limited change in expectations and obligations within the family. Such a mismatch will make the package of marriage and family less attractive to women. The conflict between traditional expectations and economic opportunities rather than individualism itself, key there, rather than individualism itself, leads to people's new marital and intimacy practices, such as delayed marriage and rising singlehood. So again, I've showed this slide before. I want to acknowledge the fantastic work of yuzhong, who I had the privilege of supervising during her MSc, but she did some interviews in Guangdong in spring of 2019. And one of her informants, who was speaking about whether to have that second child now that it was possible with the new policy, she responded, "My husband really wanted a second child after the announcement of the two-child policy because he thinks he has missed a lot of important moments when our first child was growing up. He wanted to mend his regret through a second child. I told him that if you want to mend it, take up all the responsibility of child rearing. If not, then don't ever mention this topic again. This time, I will not lower my life quality and make compromise like I did before." Again, I think speaks a lot to falling fertility. And very finally here, Jingsu's amazing ethnography of a Chinese preschool in Shanghai, it is, shows really how this whole competitive and changing educational environment generates a lot of struggle and anxiety for today's parents. I think also leading to the pressures of kind of sticking to one child, so to say, alongside the rising costs. So fertility forms in a stratified world. Moral panics around demographic figures are abound. And I think a lot of research, more research would really be welcome to delve into that, globally and comparatively. These pro-natalist campaigns that are really resurfacing with these, hugely gendered and racialized consequences, and this especially in connection with Windance Twine's fertility continuum notion, I think really we need as social scientists to keep our eyes out on these effects. Again, as many of you in the room have shown us, young women and men and different genders are having trouble finding partners, but also having trouble gaining access to reproductive technologies if need be. As Li Hongxi, Sharmila showed, work stress and exhaustion. As Song and Ji have shown, women's expectations to contribute both to household finances and to take care of all domestic work and childcare is a factor, rising healthcare and education costs too. So very final slide here. So recently I revisited Fei Xiaotong's amazing book From the Soil, in which he's kind of is really trying to theorize and account for the emergence of kind of Chinese forms of social organization. And as kind of indicated in the title, From the Soil, he points really to the kind of ways in which social organization was linked to the irrigation and farming practices. So as he puts it here, with frequent and repeated interaction occurring over a long period of time, distinctive patterns of human relationships form. All social groups are organized in some fashion. People live together in the same place so that they can be close to their fields. And where irrigation is required, people must work together as a group. So I'm almost tempted to replace, human relationships and social groups with fertility here. Distinctive patterns of fertility form. All fertility is organized in some fashion. People live together in the same place so that they can be close to their friends, their families, and so forth. So perhaps it's no longer these small-scale villages and forms of agricultural social organization, but it's more these urbanized ways of living in 996 cultures where we work too much and the like. So that's what we're trying to think with and through. So fertility forms is, in a sense, scaling up these distinctive patterns from these intimate kinship systems where we are related to people as individuals, really trying to lift it up to that more macro level of to account for the falling fertility rates, because we are not satisfied with the individualized and biologized explanations. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Io. That was really interesting. I'm just trying to bring us back onto camera.
Yes, and I'm trying to stop sharing.
Thank you.
There we go. Perfect.
So there we go. There I am. Thank you. That was so interesting. And I know that you've done really well in trying to help us keeping to time. I think we could kind of hear you talk about this for quite a long time. So thank you for keeping to time anyway. So I would just like to open up the floor to see if anyone has any questions. Please bear in mind you can use the chat box if you have a question, or pop your camera on and ask what it is that you might be interested to know. I'll give people a second to do that. So perhaps I'll take chair's privilege and ask the first question if I can. So of course, in the early part of your presentation, you were talking about kind of the intersections and the contributions around ideas about demography from disciplines like the biological sciences, reproductive sciences, demographers. And I just thought I'd ask a question about how do you think social scientists can or should be working alongside demographers, reproductive scientists to address these kind of large scale macro questions about things related to fertility decline? How should those disciplines be working together in complementary ways? I just wonder your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I've worked with reproductive scientists, clinicians, as many of us have, and this is definitely will be, so to say, new for me in the sense that I will now be engaging much more with demographers who work at this kind of national scale. And in the same way that you have to learn and you become interliterate, in Sarah's kind of nice phrase, with biologists, I have to work at becoming interliterate with demographers, and I'm not strong on numbers. But I will say this much. I think that very often the causes that I kind of listed in the beginning of the talk, I don't necessarily see them in an anthropological kind of social science qualitative sense as causes. I'm not doubting the numbers in a sense. I definitely think fertility rates are declining, and I think they're onto something in terms of pointing out that, of course, that will have consequences. I don't buy into these huge, you know, crisis, the end of the world is coming kind of thing. But of course it'll have consequences. That's a sheer kind of numbers thing. But that's what I hope to enter into these dialogues. And I think there are demographers out there who would be very, are already thinking along these lines, perhaps have for a very long time, that, you know, this notion of causality and correlation, which has always been debated in these kind of large scale studies, that of course we need anthropologists to contribute to that conversation. And I think a notion, or I hope a notion like fertility forms will kind of allow us to debate what's causality here. I mean, is individualization a cause, or is it an effect of, you know, 0 hours contracts kind of thing? And that's what I really look forward to. Just like I love engaging with my biological colleagues because I might have different opinions, I look forward to engaging on those kinds of questions. Because as always, I really feel that, you know, we definitely have a role to play, and our forms of evidence, which are qualitative, have, you know, just as much weight in my view as the numbers do. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that process.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Thank you. And I'd just like to open the floor up to others if they have questions.
And comments as well, because this is work in progress.
Oh, yes,
any thoughts or and perhaps national reflections.
I mean, I can make a comment. I'm conscious that I'm going to be talking, so I don't want to, you know, take up the floor too much. But just to say, you know, thank you so much. I really great talk as ever. And I think just the importance as well of thinking kind of, as Kylie says, in an interdisciplinary, but also in a sort of holistic way about reproduction. And I suppose from my end of things, thinking about parenting and the culture around that, and the way in which that plays into people's expectations and desires around parenthood. So I was asked to sort of talk about fertility decline the other day on the radio, and it's not at all a specialist subject because, you know, like you, I'm not a demographer, I'm not very good on numbers, but actually what they were really interested in is this idea that the expectations around having children these days are so inflated that it puts so much pressure on people to feel like you've got to be, you know, everything, your life has to be completely ready and stable and prepared, and you need to be, you know, in absolutely the right sort of point in your life before you embark on this new phase. That of course people aren't doing that in a pandemic because a lot of things are really unstable, and so anyway, it's kind of a comment really because it's echoing what you're already
but Charlotte's spot on, and what I want to add, because I definitely agree with what you're saying, what I want to add to it is that, I mean, if ever I was an adherent of rational choice theory, this is the research area I am. If you want to believe in choice, I'll tell you what, and now I'm going to start ranting, right? The choice here is, when I work in China, and that, you know, the very powerful quote from the woman in China that Yuzhong had interviewed, that, you know, it's not just that it's perfection and all these things, but let's be honest. I mean, look at the composition of this group of people who's meeting today. It's not a coincidence, because the point is, we know that at the end of the day, in terms of sheer labor, in terms of sheer putting in the effort, as soon as a child is born, the woman in a household will have double the amount of labor that they would if they didn't have a child. And here I say they, as in the woman, in personalizing to the woman. So if you are a rational choice adherent, then here is a classic case of somebody sitting down and saying, you know what, no thanks, no thanks. And I think that's what is lost in these, you know, female educational attainment, female have access to contraception. Of course, that's part of the explanation, but is it causal? Give me a break, you know. And until we have that discussion, in my view, then, you know, fair enough, we can continue to, as we have for 200 years now, place blame on especially in these gendered ways, women. But we're not going to address the question of why are fertility rates falling. So I think your comment, Charlotte, really speaks to that whole perfectionism. We know that it has very, very particular consequences for a certain gender.
Thank you.
Aaron, did you have a question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Aya. That was fantastic, and I really loved your rant, especially. It's really good to hear, you know, not just women kind of saying that stuff. And it just made me think. I'm not a demographer at all, and I'm going to be even worse at numbers than you or Charlotte, I'm sure. But one of the areas that I work in is queer birth, and what we do know is that in the UK, the numbers of lesbian couples who are having babies is going up by around 10 to 20% year on year. So why would that be?
So
you want to go on a bit of wild speculation for a bit. Why would that be in a time of fertility decline?
Yeah, my speculation would be, speaking of demographic figures, that all things equal, there's a moral panic, absolutely, as we know about, you know, parenting by different demographics, as they're called. So there's no question, but all things equal, there's also, because of TV shows, and that's why that wing, you know, we have Charlotte Kohliger in the project where we're thinking together. You know, she does these kinds of amazing cultural studies looking at how, you know, popular TV series, you know, Modern Family, whatever it might be, also create spaces. And then, of course, the sheer fact of legal access, which is slowly changing in different ways. I think those are the drivers here, that even, I can't remember when it was, and please help me, some of you in the room will definitely know who I'm speaking of here, but someone was calling it thinkability the other day, that it's now becoming thinkable in so many different parts of the world in ways that it wasn't thinkable just 10 years ago, kind of thing. So that would be my kind of hypothesis. I think we would have to do the research, but I think the sheer level of access, but also thinkability, that, wow, I actually, perhaps this is a realistic option for me in ways that were, because of the societal norm pressures, so different just 10 years ago. So I definitely think things are changing. But again, I agree with you. I think this is empirical. We need the research. But I hadn't heard those kind of trends, but it's fascinating to hear. Yeah, thank you. You're muted, Kylie.
So I put myself on mute, thinking I was taking myself off mute. Lucy's just popped in the chat saying that it was Marcin Smieta who was the one who I think coined that phrase, thinkability.
Thank you, Lucy. And Marcin, brilliant thinking as always.
He's got his hand up now. Did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask a question, actually, and thank you for the reference as well, Ayo and Lucy.
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for this fascinating talk, Ayo. And I was wondering about, I had a question about the tone of the debates that you started with, which are often alarmist, right, as you've shown in the media fragments at the beginning. So do you have any further thoughts on this? So is this alarmist tone justified? And if so, then why? You mentioned that, you know, different politicians might say that if there is a decline, that it affects the welfare systems. Or maybe from research, we know that it affects people's feelings a lot, right? And people's aspirations, so simply. And people find themselves under pressure. But then, you know, there are some other narratives, especially from some certain environmental or multi-species studies, or, you know, saying, oh, why not necessarily, you know, maybe that's okay if there's a decline. So do you have any thoughts on
I definitely. And I have to say, I've become wound up in the Danish debate here because I collaborated with a reproductive scientist who's very famous for these, looking at how sperm quality is falling, the effects of kind of pollution and chemicals. And, you know, I like these interdisciplinary collaborations. We were both interviewed for a newspaper, and the story was sensationalist. It was, you know, sperm quality is declining, the end of human race is near. And that wasn't something I necessarily wanted to kind of be associated with, but, you know, that's that. And I'm not worried about it because I'm happy with the research I do, but it does speak to this sensationalism that arises. So just my quick 2 cents, because I realize time is going. So the crisis narrative, as we know, is generative of so many things, and most of it, I think, is negative, because again, it will reify and reinforce a lot of these moral panics. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, there's the debate about migration. So, okay, if one country doesn't have enough fertility, well, you know, we redistribute. That's what's happening anyway. If you stop building walls, Fort Europe and walls to Mexico kind of thing, this wouldn't be an issue. So there's a whole debate there, which I think is so important, which I didn't address here, although I showed that ominous aspect from Viktor Orban's quote. So that debate, I think, is crucial. But the other one is that, you know, honestly, humans have always adjusted to whatever kinds of, you know, ways in which new forms of social configurations take place. So is it bad, you know, in some normative sense, that there will be a smaller group of younger people looking after a bigger group of elder people with chronic conditions and so forth? Well, it could be in the sense that if there's always a lack of people, warm hands, as they're called. But again, then there's migration and so forth. So, you know, the whole crisis narrative, I'm more interested, well, what's going to happen now? Because as we see in China, in Japan, these are kind of real live cases in a sense. Social life changes, expectations change, perhaps openings, thinkabilities arise because of these changes, which can be positive. But I guess as social scientists, we also have to be very keen to follow these unintended consequences, which very often can be harmful, as you put it, Marcin. They can really be harmful in terms of stigmatizing and so forth. But I think the crisis, that's sensationalism. I don't think, if there is a crisis, for me, it's the climate, and that's what we really have to be worried about. Yeah. So thank you, Marcin.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your everyone's questions. And Ayo, thank you for also some really thoughtful and interesting answers from you and further comments. So just in an aim to keep us to time, I'll just say thank you so much for your time on this talk. And I'm going to hand over to Cathy, who's going to introduce our second speaker. Over to you, Cathy.
And thank you, Ayo, again for this great first talk. So now a second speaker today, Charlotte Faircloth, who is an associate professor of social science in the UCL Social Research Institute, where she's based at the Thomas Coram Research Unit. So as you certainly know, she has published a number of excellent papers and books, including with colleagues from Kent. She's the co-author of Parenting Cultural Studies. She has also recently co-edited Parenting in Global Perspective, Negotiating Ideologies of Kinship, Self and Politics. And a latest co-edited book include Conceiving Contemporary Parenthood, Intentions, Expectations and Reproductive Technologies, which will be shortly published by Routledge. So today she will tell us about a more recent research during COVID time and the lesson she learned from it. Thank you, Charlotte. I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Cathy. And yeah, in a bid to avoid the faffing around with Zoom, sorry, I slightly cut into your talk. Anyway, at least hopefully everyone can see the slides up now. So yeah, as Cathy said, my name's Charlotte, and I always feel like a little bit of an interloper when I come to the Human Reproduction Study Group, because actually the majority of my work has kind of been about parenting, and I always feel like maybe that's, you know, sort of slightly at the other end of the spectrum from what a lot of you work on, but I'm sure I don't need to explain the connection and the fact that we obviously think about a lot of the same sorts of issues. So the kinds of things that I'm interested in are changes to what's called parenting culture, the sort of expectations around how we raise children. And the majority of my work's been in the UK, and that's been looking at sort of related to that issues around sort of gender equality or couple relationships in particular, or infant feeding. But today, as Cathy says, I'm going to be talking about a project about the impact of COVID on family life. And that's called Families and Community in a Time of COVID, or FACT, and to talk about some of the methodological and ethical quandaries that it has provoked. So this is a vignette that I sort of wanted to kick off with, and we'll, you know, come back to it after I've explained a bit more about the study. So just to explain right at the start, we gave each of the families in our study a sort of fruit or flower-based what's the word? Anyway, you know what I mean. I was about to say acronym, but that's not it. Anyway, this allows us to kind of put our participants together in a family, as it were, so they're more easily identifiable. So I'm writing to a potential participant here by mobile phone, and I say, this is Charlotte from the FACT COVID study, just double checking to see if our email came through and, you know, whether you'd like to set up a time for our interview soon. And she writes back, unfortunately, the incentive is not enough for my partner to participate. Would it still be £40 for my household? I say, oh, thank you for getting back to me. Yes, it is £40 per household, which means at least 2 people over the age of 12 taking part in 2 interviews each, one now, one next year. I'm really sorry we can't offer you a higher amount, but we have very limited funding. Would it help if we did the interview with you and your partner together? It's not something we normally do, but, you know, would be happy to if that made a difference. She says that would help. And when would we receive payment? The first £20 would be within a week or so of completing the email via an online kind of voucher, and likewise the second one next year. Then she says, okay, when do you want to complete the first one? So today I'm just sort of going to talk about some of the issues, I suppose, that brought up for me, that exchange and you know, the subsequent relationship that I had with this participant as part of the FACT project. So just to give a quick overview, I'm going to talk briefly about the UK kind of pandemic context in terms of policy and media responses, then a little bit more about FACT. But then, you know, to get into the meat of it, I guess, is thinking about these ethical and methodological challenges of doing research on, you know, parenting or reproduction, or indeed sort of anything really in a pandemic. And then also sort of through that, I suppose you'll also be getting a flavour of our findings. So, you know, I think the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on families and relationships, or, you know, and obviously reproduction being part of that, doesn't really need reiterating, because, you know, for the first time in the post-industrialized era, the main institutions of social life, including education, care and work have largely been pushed back into the home, or pushed into the home, exposing ever further the inequalities around things like gender or generation on which so much of family life revolves. And obviously Aya was kind of talking a bit about this as well. As well as making really, really clear just how sort of different what the variation is in this kind of concept of family, you know, who we live with, where we live, like what kind of, you know, resources or relationships we sort of understand that to be. So again, this is very much kind of UK based. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the policy response when COVID hit, I think it's kind of fair to say that the national policy focus around children, parents and families was pretty weak. There was a sort of more immediate kind of system of support, I suppose, for workers with things like the furlough scheme and for businesses, but actually the understanding of the, you know, relationship between those sort of policies and the fact that many...
Food, darling, it's just my...
Oh, sorry, maybe someone's microphone is on.
I just bent down to...
Oh, is there some... Sorry, Cathy, are you able as the host to check if someone's...
Yeah, Zeynep, I think you should mute your microphone.
Oh,
sorry. Sorry, I'm not able to do it for you.
Nice to hear from you. Anyway, the UK policy context was kind of dominated by lockdowns. That was the sort of approach that was taken in the UK. And the first and the third of those involved school closures, which obviously for a lot of parents involved suddenly having kids at home when they would normally expect them to be at school or nursery, and therefore they would be able to do their work. And the government sort of appreciation of that fact did not really seem to feature in their support for workers. So there was just this huge kind of crunch. I think, you know, as lots of people have sort of commented, we'll kind of get onto this in a minute, that had huge implications for two kind of issues in particular that were picked up in the both media and kind of policy response. So the first of those was huge concern around child development. So suddenly we've got a whole, you know, generation of children at home. What is this going to mean for their education? You know, so there was kind of charity reports, such as this one from the Royal Foundation, like talking about the importance of, you know, intervention, I suppose, with children in the home, but at a distance, because obviously the normal forms or classes or whatever were limited. But also the second kind of major issue in terms of families, I guess, from a media point of view, was around gender equality. And again, you know, Io kind of mentioned this, but I think it's been fairly well recognised that the impact of the pandemic has not been felt uniformly. So people of colour and women with childbearing responsibilities in particular have been the most badly affected, as have most of the sort of more female industries, you know, things like hospitality, for example. Women with childcare responsibilities are those most likely to request furlough or to leave their jobs or to be made redundant. So just to kind of put this in perspective, in the UK, 15% of women have left the workforce during the pandemic, and it took 20 years to increase maternal employment by 20%. So there is a huge kind of generational rollback that has gone on in the space of the last year. So it was in this kind of context of, you know, the concerns, the panic, you know, that we set up the FACT project. The person in the middle is Catherine Twomley, who's the PI on the project, and then me and Humaira Iqbal on the left there, based at UCL, and these are our lovely research assistants on the right. Sorry, I'm racing through just because there's so much to get through and time is a bit short, but these are our objectives, looking, as you can see, mainly sort of at the challenges experienced by families with children during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the thing that I'll just say about this is that we take a relational understanding of persons to kind of unpack the decisions and practices that are negotiated across and between connected individuals. And for us, that was really important in the context of studying a pandemic, you know, the spread of an infectious disease, which by its very definition requires the kind of agreement and consensus of a family, but also across families and a community, and arguably, you know, countries, a global community, to contain its spread. We're part of a international consortium that we're leading. So there's 10 countries around the world with sort of using similar methods and sharing the same research questions, with the idea that this comparison will sort of allow us to understand the role of, I suppose, local policies, but also cultural meanings and practices that kind of shape people's experiences of the pandemic. These are the kind of methods that we're using. So it's mixed methods, multimodal diaries and interviews, and that's been going on for most of the last year. We're just doing the final interviews with participants now. But to get sort of back to the point, as it were, the thing that I'm interested in talking about today is the ethics of asking anybody to participate in research, you know, short of that that will directly sort of save lives, like, you know, taking part in a vaccine trial, for example, I think is very, very complicated. You know, is it ethical to ask people to give their time and energy to a research project when their time and energy is already so stretched? Can we really say that this project will have tangible benefits for the people we work with? And I think these are the kinds of questions that we encounter all of the time as researchers, but perhaps, you know, particularly for those of us working from qualitative perspectives, and particularly now in the context of COVID, they seem really, really pressing. So in designing our study, initially unfunded, we were really mindful of our participants' lack of time and the potentially sort of traumatic circumstances that they might actually be living through. But we were also very conscious of our own compressed kind of and stretched workloads. You know, this was unfunded, it was the pandemic. I'm sure you all know about the online pivot in terms of teaching and what a complete disaster that was. But we also really felt strongly that we wanted to get the project off the ground quickly so that we could capture some of the accounts of that early lockdown kind of chaotic period. So we needed an approach that was kind of flexible enough to fit into the lives of our participants, but that was kind of gave, you know, scope for both reflexive but also more cursory engagements with our inquiries that were also responsive to events that were going on. So for the majority of participants, we were very lucky to be given the use of this app called Indemo, pro bono by the company. And that's a kind of online ethnographic app. So you can kind of see here how it works. We can post kind of questions to participants and then they can add their comments. It's almost like a kind of personal Facebook that we could then sort of correspond with the participant about their comments, if that, you know, but not necessarily in real time. So it was kind of reflective and responsive. And in some ways it was really nice because it gave more space than the interview kind of encounter. And we ourselves could be a little bit more, you know, selective, I suppose, with our thoughts and our questions, which we hope in the long run kind of saved everybody a bit of time. This is just an example of a picture that someone uploaded. Participants were also able to upload videos if they wanted to. And I think there's something quite poignant here. This is a mum talking about her daughter doing her homework, her schoolwork at home, I should say. And the 5-year-old daughter slides her sheets under the door for the mother to look at whilst the mother is working. And I think it really captures something very nice about that kind of presence and absence in the home with children. But also you can kind of see, if you look closely at the words used here, she starts talking about we, when we work, me and my husband, but then it's me that the daughter, you know, asks to look at the work. And you kind of can start reading between the lines a bit around, well, who is actually responsible for the management of this homeschooling? And obviously then that's something that we can kind of talk to the participant about. But we realised pretty quickly that the Indemo app was not something that was going to help us reach everyone. And in a bid to sort of make participation a bit less time consuming, we also offered phone interviews, either sort of through something like Zoom or just literally calling people on their mobile. And this was particularly appropriate for the family like the Jackfruits, who I kicked off with the, you know, the vignette, kicked off with their vignette. because they were a family who were sharing one mobile phone. They didn't have a Wi-Fi connection. They were living in very cramped conditions. So sort of setting up individual, Zoom calls with each family member, or like expecting them each to have a device to fill out the Indemo app with, was just completely sort of inappropriate. So that mum, Jackfruit mum, had heard about our study through one of the adverts we posted online, and she had filled out an eligibility survey indicating that she was Black, living with her partner and 3 children, and her mother part-time. They had a household income of around £16,000 to £20,000. And we were really, really keen to speak with her because, as I'm sure won't be a surprise to some of you who've done similar kind of research, it was very hard to recruit people from these sorts of backgrounds. We had more sort of white middle-class families living in London who wanted to share their stories. But when I called at the agreed time, so as you saw, I kind of set up a time to call for the interview. The phone rang for a really long time, and then she sort of finally answered, sounding really confused, and could hear the children shouting in the background. And she'd had the meeting down as being another day, or had forgotten or something. And she said, this is not the best time really, because her partner had just fallen asleep. This was 5 o'clock on a weekday, because I think he works nights. And I offered to call back or rearrange. She said, oh no, but how long will it take? And I said about 30 to 45 minutes for the first interview. She says, well, I just want to get it out of the way. Can we just do a joint interview with my mum instead, because the mother happened to be there? And I said, okay. And I heard the mother sort of explaining to the grandmother about the study. And I could hear her saying, she's paying. And I forgot I said I was going to do it. She only needs 2 adults. So just sit down. It won't take long. It'll only take 20 minutes. And then she says to me, okay, we're ready. And so again, I think, do I kick off? Do I press ahead with this? What kind of, questions does this raise? Anyway, to cut a long story short, this was the sort of sample of people that we were able to recruit. And I should say that it was partly because we got some funding from the British Academy that we were able to subsidise some incentives for families from lower socioeconomic groups, which obviously was kind of why the Jackfruit family agreed to take part in the project at all. But this itself kind of posed a real ethical conundrum for many of us. It was palpable that participants were only taking part with a view to receiving the voucher. And, we also kind of reflected that this was just yet another thing for these families to be doing. We were sort of conscious that, because everything was happening virtually, there was no risk of infection or anything like that. But in a WhatsApp chat between project team members, I said, one thing that's made me really uncomfortable is how desperate the Jackfruit couple are for the voucher and how little they clearly want to do the interview. I feel horrible. And this became even more excruciating when admin delays at UCL meant that people didn't receive their voucher for about 6 weeks, when we'd said, oh, it will be, with you shortly. I'm just going to start summing up again, because I know time is tight, but again, just some research reflections that I shared in the in one of our shared documents. I said I felt profoundly uncomfortable. This was going to be the only joint interview that we'd be including at this point. I was, conscious that if we delayed, it would mean a delay in the incentive taking part. So in the end, I gave a kind of quick overview of the study, sought verbal consent, and asked my questions quickly. I didn't ask for elaboration, even when I should have done. We raced through so that we were done within 25 minutes. This is not the kind of fieldwork experience that leaves a good taste, much as it was very useful for our study. So the rich details that we would normally hope to elicit in a longer or in-person narrative were absent, but I think it's fair to say that it was still a really useful encounter. So the mother spoke in that interview, for example, of how lonely she'd been. Her partner is a key worker working nights, so she'd largely been on her own with the children, locked up indoors, as she put it. And she talks a lot about how they had sort of broken the rules around bubbling so that her mother could come and live with them. And again, from a kind of risk consciousness perspective, that was really important. So these were the kind of themes that were coming out from parents about their experiences of looking after children during the pandemic. A huge anxiety around catching COVID, because particularly for single mothers or single parent families, I should say, a huge worry about who would help, who would be there to look after the children if they got ill. Again, I'm sorry, I'm just racing through, but this gives you a flavour of the kind of thing we were hearing. This is a single mother with 3 children who talks about rationing nappies for the children, for the baby, because she can't afford to keep the baby in nappies during the day. So she maybe puts the baby on a mat and then uses the nappy at night. And it was really critical for our study that we had families like this represented. There are obviously limitations to doing research in such a way, and they are mainly kind of resource-based, but they're also class-based to the extent that an invitation to tell one's story, I think, is not always one that is warmly received and accepted and sort of, taken up. So doing any kind of research in a pandemic requires some methodological acrobatics. Those of us who normally rely on a kind of deep hanging out or participant observation, where the body is itself a research instrument, this online environment obviously poses some challenges. Any sort of social happenstance is stymied and rapport is less easily developed. But again, it does not mean that these kind of encounters are not valuable. By contrast, it highlights the importance of other kinds of observations, I think, made by the researcher during the interview, and which in the end actually go on to be critical to the analysis. So just to kind of wrap up, our project is just one, as I said, of a wide range of projects around the world. And there are ethical and methodological negotiations that have a really different hue in each of those different locations. So incentives are considered non-negotiable in Chile. If you want to do research there, you have to have incentives, but they would be considered unethical in Sweden. Meanwhile, the use of Indemo in Singapore would be challenging when trying to work with lower income migrant worker population, where again, phones and Wi-Fi are not kind of possible. And whereas for other partners, it would be considered completely acceptable. So these international kind of this international framework, I think, reminds us of the at once local and global repercussions of COVID and how each must be taken into account as we attempt to manage the methodological and ethical encounters of an internationally comparative project. And I will stop there. Sorry for rushing through. But if you're interested, there's updates about the study there.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for this very timely and interesting talk, which raises a lot of crucial questions. And be reassured, I think the question you raised really are questions which are very relevant for all of us, like in reproduction and parenting studies, especially when working with over-vulnerable people. So yes, thank you for that. I also wanted to mention that this question have been explored and discussed in more length in Charlotte's recent paper that I had the chance to read, which has been published recently in Families, Relationships and Societies. Fascinating paper, and I highly recommend. So with 5 minutes, I would say, for questions. As I said at the beginning, please feel free to switch on your camera and ask directly your question to Charlotte.
I think Pam has her hand up, Cathy.
Who that, sorry?
Pam, I think.
Pam Lowe has her hand up.
Yeah. Can you unmute yourself?
Hiya, hopefully you can hear me. Hi Charlotte, thank you for a really interesting paper. And yeah, so I think the issues you raised are really pertinent, particularly in the pandemic. But of course, they raise similar issues in all ethnography. So we did an ethnographic project around families living in disadvantage in one particular area. And I probably shouldn't say this, and I will deny knowledge of it, but as a research team, we ended up buying extra vouchers and just giving them out to people because we could afford it, and not counting them in the research in some ways, because some people didn't have food when you went around there, and it was just, or, you know, you can't, if you're financially able to do that, then it just seems a bit mean to leave them without food. But leaving aside that, I mean, I know that's another, you know, ethical dilemma about that, but there you go. So yeah, so one of the things I was really interested in is about whether or not housing came into a big difference about how you approach the study, because obviously people in small flats with lots of overcrowded small flats were in a very different position to people in houses, and I wondered whether any of that came out in the study at all. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of space was a really major theme actually that came out of the study. So particularly families living in cramped accommodation during lockdown, it was a huge kind of struggle. And particularly, as I said, because these were the families who were often most worried about catching the virus, even if they, could technically have gone out to the local park, they often felt that was too unsafe, and so they would literally be indoors. They, without their own garden, obviously in the flats. One mother said that they hadn't been out except she had gone to the shops for 3 months between sort of March and May last year. And it was really striking. We asked our participants to send us pictures of space, your garden space, your workspace, your home space, any kind of space that they wanted. And a lot of the middle class participants like, here's the garden and this is where I work, and then we share the kitchen and this kind of thing. And of course, then for the families living in more cramped conditions, it was like there was one room that they were all sharing all the time. And it was a really noticeable theme actually. So yes, we have looked at that a bit.
Thanks, it's really interesting. Thanks.
Any other question will be, I think, the last one before we move on.
Okay, can I quickly ask one, Cathy? It's Ayo here. Yeah. So related exactly to this, Charlotte, because I agree with everyone who said that. It's the same in our project on chronic conditions. We really debated how do you make sure that you speak to people living with chronic conditions from different backgrounds, because those who have time tend to be the ones who have more resources and so forth. But we had a debate about whether basically is medical anthropology, sociology theory based on people who have more time, in the sense that that's where we usually get the rich data, so to speak. And I know that there are a lot of researchers who very specifically work with Baldwin. I'm not trying to suggest that people don't do that, but broadly speaking, even though we set out to do things as projects go along, and that's what I heard you saying, Charlotte, that you just run into barriers for very obvious reasons, and then you have to get the project done, so you tend to speak with people who have more time. So I'm just thinking, what do you think it would do to your thinking, your theorizing, the concepts that you're trying to develop, that you observe this shift, or sorry, tension?
Absolutely. I think it's a really, really helpful point, actually. So I suppose in some ways it's to make sure that when you go into the analysis period, that you are genuinely allowing things to emerge from what people have told you, if they have had the time and inclination, and particularly from those kind of groups, and to make sure that you're not kind of reading experiences in. But again, doing decent analysis requires time, and as researchers we're really, really pressed. It's not a funded project in the sense of our time being bought out, so we have like regular conversations between the three of us and trying to sort of triangulate these things. But I think it's really helpful to think about that relationship between data and theory, and the kind of the way that they inform each other. So yes, I will take that on board and make sure it sort of stays at the forefront of our mind as we're writing things up. Thank you.
Thank you. Very useful comments. Unfortunately, we already have to move on, yeah, so I'll leave it to Kylie. Thanks. Thank you again, Charlotte, for your talk.
Yes, thank you. It was really interesting. So I'd like to now introduce our third and final speaker for today's session. We've got Dr. Marie Greenfield, and I was very privileged to watch some of her recent presentation. It wasn't that recent now, a while ago now, a presentation of hers at a conference, I can't remember which, and I thought to myself, that work sounds so interesting. I'll make a note for that for future human repro events. And then when it came to choose our speakers for today, I was like, yes, we definitely have to have this really interesting speaker. So Dr. Marie Greenfield is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at the King's College London. She was initially employed on her current post to undertake research examining the perinatal experiences of LGBTQ+ people, and particularly expanding on her PhD thesis, which was looking at the choices that women made in pregnancy and birth, particularly after having a traumatic birth. So her work was going to go and look at, as she described to us earlier on, queer people's experiences of a traumatic birth. But then COVID-19 happened, and her work took a slightly different turn, I would say a really exciting and very interesting turn. And so she has now shifted her research to look at examining the perinatal experiences of new and expectant parents during the pandemic, and has had huge amounts of interest and engagement in her research. So I'll hand over to you now, and I'm really interested to hear some more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kylie, and thank you to Cathy for arranging the day, and thank you so much to Charlotte and Io for being amazing speakers. I don't actually want to be talking now because I want to sit and think about what you've both said, but needs must. So there we go. So hospitals are generally seen as a place where babies can be born safely, and they're a place that a couple go into while in labour, and then they come out as a family. And today I want to look at whether COVID-19 and the restrictions imposed because of the pandemic have disrupted this narrative. And I'm going to take you briefly through a really brief overview of the national picture of changes, a little bit about the research design and the data that was captured, and then go through these three main themes that have kind of come out of my research, which are unpredictable care, unclear communication, and is care safe? And then have a little look at the practical effects that we found of these changes in views. So maternity care isn't care that can be delayed because we can predict sometime in advance roughly when that care is going to be needed. But unless we're talking about an elective caesarean birth, it's not predictable as to exactly when it's going to need to be delivered. And it poses a problem to us that it's actually still more predictable than emergency care. It's not care that you kind of need right now, so we can have some planning about it. And that's put maternity care in a really odd position because various government bodies have issued advice, but the nature has been that it's changed an awful lot. And there have been 14 sets of national guidance issued within the first month of lockdown, which people are trying to interpret, perhaps, you know, a couple of months before their baby's due, and they're trying to interpret all this guidance and predict into the future what is care going to look like when I'm having my baby. In addition to the national sets of guidance that were issued, each NHS trust also updated their own guidance on the services available. For some that was kind of, you know, guidance coming out all the time, and for some it was fewer amounts of guidance. So my research was carried out very early in the UK's first lockdown. So we're looking at the changes that happened in March and April 2020, as those are the ones that affected my participants. Maternity care sits in this really weird, unique position where the demand for care is known in advance, but the precise dates that it will be required aren't known in advance. So it's not care that can be delayed. Predictability depends on the birth choices that individual pregnant women or people make, but those choices then have an interrelationship with the services that are offered by the NHS Trust. So there's some really interesting kind of power relationships going on there. At King's, we put together a steering group to design some rapid response research, which I carried out between the 10th and the 24th of April 2020. And at the time, that felt like, oh, we're quite far into the pandemic. But looking back now, this was really, you know, quite early on in the pandemic. And the list on the left-hand side here, I hope the left-hand side, the bullet points, should show you the overarching intentions for the research, affected by both theoretical ideas and practical considerations. And then the blue box on the right-hand side shows you the changes that the steering group discussed might affect new and expectant parents. And from a social constructivist view, I was really interested to see what sense people were making of the changes and how they interrelated, and that they weren't just about what is the NHS offering or not. As Charlotte touched on in her presentation, this fear of contracting COVID was massively you know, really huge to an awful lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, in a way that perhaps it's less so now. From the overarching design and the list of factors affecting parents' choice, we drew out our research question, which was, what is the real-time social and cultural impact of a global pandemic on the lived experience of maternity care in the UK? Just to take you through the research design, the survey was entirely online, as was all recruitment at this point, and it had three main parts. We asked demographic questions about ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and how many weeks pregnant somebody was. The survey was open to all new and expectant parents, so that's people who are pregnant and partners. Then there were some psychometric tests, which I'm not going to talk about today, and then the bulk of the questionnaire were these 9 qualitative questions, with slightly different routing for people who hadn't had the baby yet and people who had had the baby. The psychometric tests were only administered to those who had given birth already. I was expecting that we might get around 100 completed responses, maybe 50, you know, something like that. And we were quite overwhelmed. We closed the survey after 2 weeks. We weren't expecting to, because the amount of data was just enormous. And most of the people who responded were still pregnant at the time of the research. A handful of partners, and then, you know, 300 people who'd given birth. And the responses, yeah, raised some ethical questions for me, which I think relate a lot to what to Charlotte's presentation about, is it right to be talking to people about this kind of thing in the pandemic? There was such an outpouring of emotion, and the responses were coming in so fast, and people obviously really needed a release and to talk about the issues that they were facing and their fears and their stresses. And I don't know, is research the right place to do that? Does that fulfill a useful role? Or is it taking advantage of people's emotional state in order to carry out research? But what we found was that there were a real variety in the planned place of birth at this point. The majority of people were planning a vaginal birth rather than a caesarean birth. Some were planning to give birth on labour ward, a significantly large amount on a midwife-led unit or a birth centre. We didn't separate those two out because although they have different meanings and different setups within maternity services, people were using the terms in a kind of interchangeable way. So they're saying, you know, I'm going to be midwife-led at the birth centre. It's not very clear to us whether this was like an alongside birth centre or a standalone unit. Some people indicated that they were intending to have a vaginal birth. They're just saying, like, you know, a normal birth, or they were saying a water birth, but they didn't say where they were wanting that birth. And then some people didn't say, but when we were asking them about their plans for birth, were saying other things were most important to them. So they're saying, I wanted to have my husband and my mum there, for example, but not telling us where there was. The first thing that came out of the data was how very unpredictable people were finding the situation. And birth is unpredictable at the best of times, but giving birth at the beginning of a pandemic, when you don't know what services are going to be available, was really worrying for people. Some people had decided to have an elective caesarean to reduce the unknown, but for most people who had already planned to have an elective caesarean in some way elective, they were worried that their caesarean birth was going to be disrupted. At the other end of the kind of choice spectrum, home births were being disrupted an awful lot as well. Some NHS trusts withdrew home birth services entirely, which was quite different from in other countries. We know that home births were being encouraged because they were seen as much less risk. And then in some cases, home births were going ahead, but rules were being introduced about who was allowed to be present, which were causing problems for some people. And then even with going into a labour ward, the rules were changing so rapidly that for this last mum, her husband and mum went in with her. And then when her husband went out to get something from the car, the rules actually had changed whilst they were in the hospital. And when he came back, the rule was now that you could only have one birth partner. The second theme that came out was how unclear everything was. And this was really a theme about communication, and that people were really unhappy with the communication that was being offered to them. That was related to the feeling of unpredictability in terms of everything seemed to be disorganised. And some clinics were being closed, which meant that people were losing access to talk to the healthcare professionals that they wanted to talk to, as for example with this breech clinic, and we heard about lots of VBAC clinics and things like that being closed as well. Then there was a problem of misinformation, with so many different sets of guidance being issued. Some trusts did spread misinformation, saying, for example, that free births were illegal. And there's been quite a strong campaign to get trusts who'd put that information out onto their Facebook sites, onto their Twitter feeds, to remove it because it's incorrect. But where that did happen, and where parents saw that and were aware that that was wrong information, it really ruined a relationship of trust, because if you couldn't believe what they'd said there, what else could you believe about what they were saying? And at a time of huge stress in terms of both being pregnant and a pandemic, losing that trusting relationship really damaged some people's experiences of pregnancy and birth. And then there was issues with partners being able to talk to midwives, and partners, the strongest theme that came through from the partners was that their access to midwives and to consultants had entirely gone. So this last quote is from a lesbian co-mother who, her partner is pregnant, her partner's going to give birth, but her partner's on medication, which means that she can't breastfeed. And the medication will mean that the mum and baby need to stay in the hospital for a couple of days after the birth for the baby to be monitored. But the lesbian partner is not allowed to go in and breastfeed the baby, which has been their plan the whole way through. They've gone through an entire lactation protocol so that she's going to be able to breastfeed. She's not going to be allowed anymore because no visitors are allowed. And there was quite a big theme of the changes that were brought in being strongly heterocentric there. And the last theme that emerged was a feeling of being unsafe, which really contrasts with the idea that when you have a baby, you know, there's that kind of media trope of, oh, your waters are broken, rush to the hospital, got to be there, then you'll be safe. Not anymore. The closures in home births and the closures of local midwife-led units led to a lot of people who have precipitous labours being really concerned about actually being able to get to the hospital in time to have their baby there, and being really worried that they were going to end up having the baby in the car because they just weren't going to get there in time. So this first participant was talking about the fact she lived in rural Wales. The hospital's 2 hours away. I've lived in rural Wales. My hospital was 2 hours away. I have a huge amount of empathy for that feeling. But if her last baby was born in an hour and a half, is she going to get there in time? Another concern was catching COVID from being in the hospital. And that was particularly a worry if you were, you know, going to be potentially bringing an illness back to somebody else. So as for the second participant. And there was this, the perception of hospitals really changed from being a place where you went to get rid of an illness to being a place where you went and you would quite possibly come out with an illness, because the information about how it was transmitted wasn't clear. And this point was before there were proper tests for COVID. That was a real issue for the last participant who I've quoted here. Her husband came down with COVID symptoms as she went into labour. So she was then taken into hospital on her own with no one, because you were only allowed one birth partner and they had to be from the same household. But obviously they couldn't be when he was self-isolating. At that point, no tests for COVID were available, so she and he couldn't be tested. She was then taken for a caesarean birth on her own, and describes very upsettingly staff arguing over her while she's in theatre, lying there with an epidural in. She'd planned a home birth, so this was really quite a long way from the birth that she'd wanted. Then for her caesarean recovery, she tells us that when she was admitted upstairs, the midwife had told her not to buzz unless it was an actual emergency, because it was inconvenient to put on the PPE. And she describes that that's actually what happened then. And when she got home, her partner was fine. It had probably not been COVID, and she didn't get sick at all. But there's a lack of safety that can come from being in the hospital and from interacting with NHS services. So these three themes of unpredictable care, unclear about what care is going to be available, and unsafe care had some practical effects in the data that we had. As I said before, the majority of our participants were still pregnant, and so we don't actually have huge amounts of outcome data. But what we do know is that there seemed to be a significant change for planned caesarean births, a massive rise in home birth interest, and about 4% of currently pregnant people who were considering free birth as a result of the pandemic. And what I'm going to go to do next is to take you through our findings on each of those three. So caesarean births, planned caesarean births, were decreasing and increasing in different people. So in some cases, the hospital were cancelling, or the hospital were refusing a maternal request caesarean, which they hadn't yet agreed to. And in some cases, the parents were cancelling. But at the same time, in order to increase predictability, some parents were actually asking to change to a caesarean or considering asking that as well. And for three participants, who'd already had their babies, they said that the stress of having a baby during COVID, they felt was a significant cause as to why they'd ended up with a caesarean birth. And given that we didn't actually ask any questions like that, this is information that they've volunteered themselves. For those who had previously planned a caesarean birth and where that was still going ahead, a significant number were facing anxiety either about, was it going to be cancelled? Was it going to be a good choice for them to have it? Or they were concerned that they were going to have a loss of experience because of the COVID restrictions that were in place. The rise in home birth interest was really interesting, and the reasons for it were quite varied. So for some people, that was about wanting their partner's presence throughout, or wanting a second birth partner, or wanting their children to be present. For others, it was a really kind of practical thing of, I've got no childcare. At that point in the pandemic, it wasn't clear whether you could send your children to somebody else's house whilst you went into labour, or whether that had to be your partner staying at home while you went into a hospital. And for some, it was a fear of hospital or a fear of midwives as a vector for infection, and feeling that if it was in your own home, then it was safer. And for some, the concern was that there was a lack of connection to the hospital and midwives because of all the care moving to online care. But it wasn't universal. And actually what we found was that amongst Black, Asian and mixed ethnicity women, the numbers who were planning a home birth at the beginning of their pregnancy had reduced by 50%. In some cases, that was because they'd chosen not to have a home birth, but in some cases that was because the NHS Trust were no longer facilitating them. I don't know if that rise in interest is going to be reflected in the figures for home births, because of course trusts were cancelling them, and where there's been an increase in interest, trusts haven't necessarily been able to react fast enough to facilitate those home births. The results for free birth were incredibly interesting. We didn't ask about free birth. People volunteered this information, and we were quite surprised by the results. This was completely unanticipated. Before the pandemic, one person in our survey had planned to have a free birth, and we don't know the figures for free birth. we know that only 2% of people choose home births in the UK, but free birth figures aren't actually collected anywhere. So one person out of 1,700 probably feels about right. But 72 people, by the time that we did our survey, were seriously considering free birth. And that was almost 4% of the currently pregnant participants. And for all 71, excluding the one who'd previously planned a free birth, that was because of either COVID or the restrictions imposed. The other really interesting figure that came out there was when we broke down our sample by sexual orientation, and we found that lesbian, gay and bisexual and queer women were made up around 4% of our sample as a whole, but they made up 14% of those considering free birth, which was incredibly interesting. We don't have explanations for it yet. What we can see overall is that many people were considering changing their birth plans to avoid the issues that they saw with the maternity service that was unpredictable, unclear, or unsafe. And those changes were happening in really different directions, from people choosing to give birth at home with nobody else, with no medical person present, to choosing to have a non-medically indicated elective caesarean birth. But all of those changes centered around these changing perceptions of risk. So if change in perception of risk is the underlying cause for the change in the birthplace preferences, then the question that I'd like to pose to everybody at the end of this is, has COVID permanently changed the risk discourse when we think about birthplace? And I think that's a question whose answer is going to lie in the future after the end of the pandemic. I'd just briefly like to say thank you to everybody who's been involved in the project. And thank you to the organisers of today.
Thank you so much for that. It was so nice to get to hear a little bit more about your research. I was, as I said to you in the introduction, I've been looking to try and put together some research of my own looking at this, and I put in a couple of bids that were unsuccessful. So it's going to be really nice to hear some of your publications as they're coming through. Did you want to say anything about those papers that you've got in the pipeline, or places where you've got people who want to read a little bit more? I know you said that. No.
Yeah. The paper on free birth has been published. There is a paper hopefully shortly to have its revisions accepted. We're in that torturous phase, looking at LGBT experiences of birth during COVID, and then there's a couple more to come out later on.
That follows quite neatly onto my next question. I was going to say about given that the focus of your fellowship was going to be, or the piece of work that you're doing was going to be looking at LGBTQ people's experiences of birth and trauma. I was going to say, could you pick up and talk about that any more, about how you did find those differences, if there were any differences in this study?
Yeah, there were huge differences, as there were for Black and ethnic minority women. And I think what's really interesting is that this survey unintentionally has become the largest survey of currently pregnant LGBT people in the UK. And the only reason that it's become that is because we actually asked the question about sexual orientation and gender identity. And that is a question that isn't usually asked in maternity research. Asking it was interesting. It caused an awful lot of negotiation amongst the team who were putting together the survey, and some of the responses from participants were also interesting. There were a couple of participants who were really upset that those questions were asked, and who sent back responses that just didn't answer any of the rest of the questions, just answered those ones, and were very upset that they were asked.
So they were upset. So what was the negotiations, and what was the dislike of the participants? What was it they didn't like? Sorry, I didn't follow that bit.
Participants were, two participants objected to gender being asked as a question, despite the fact that this survey included biological dads. They saw that question, because it came after a question about sexual orientation. They saw it as being asking only about transgender people.
Right.
And interpreted it that way, and made comments about, obviously I'm a woman because you're asking about pregnancy and birth. And 2 participants objected to the questions about sexual orientation and said that one said that only heterosexual people would be pregnant, and the second said that it was entirely irrelevant and shouldn't be asked.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you. And Heather has got her hand up with a question. Heather?
I do, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for these wonderful presentations today. I really have enjoyed them. I was really intrigued by your last statement in your talk about permanent changes that you anticipate might have come because of the pandemic. And I'd just love to hear your thoughts on what you think those might be.
I think they might be really varied. I mean, one change that I think, unfortunately, that we're seeing is that you know, I can go to the pub with 6 mates, but I can't go and offer. I work as a doula as well as being an academic. I can't go and offer breastfeeding support in my local hospital because my local hospital still has 1 hour a day for 1 visitor. If I go to the hospital near where I work, which is King's College London, they allow 24-hour visiting. They're back to 24-hour visiting again, so I can go and offer breastfeeding support there. And I think there could be permanent changes to when partners are allowed in during birth. I think we could see the end of your partner comes in with you, and we could see your partner can't come in until you've had a vaginal examination, which is really interesting in terms of consent. And I think there's a danger that we could see that become permanent. I think we could see the 1 birth partner only becoming permanent, and we could see the NHS making conditions attached to home birth support, in terms of there's been some conditions attached during the pandemic of no children allowed to be in the house, so you have to find somewhere else for your children to go, of there only being allowed to be 1 person in the room with you, and things like that. On the other side, I think we could see far more people being interested in home births and far more people questioning policies. And I think that's really exciting to see some of that power balance redressed there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Julia. Julia had her hand up.
Hello, Mary, I'd really like to talk to you more another time about all this, but I was really pleased to see you come back to this idea of risk interpretation at the end, because I think the way risks are interpreted and balanced is always a huge part of decision making. And I suppose, just to add to what you just said, something I've seen through advocacy work and other things I'm doing is that it meant that a very tangible risk factor was attached to the hospital setting for nearly all people compared to just a few. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know if that's something you noticed, and if you do doulaing work, you'll be very conscious that there's always been a narrative around the risks that are not articulated that are associated with hospitals, but suddenly that was at the forefront of everyone's mind in a way that I think many people's, I can't say everyone's, but many more people's minds than I'd ever seen before. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
I think you've put it really well. Yeah, it's so interesting to see that hospitals were suddenly perceived as this risky place. And yeah, and interesting to see how health professionals themselves dealt with those risks as well. We've heard of lots of cases of amongst the free birth participants of midwives saying, you can, we've withdrawn the home birth service, but you can just stay at home and have your baby. And I think that's something that in the 15 years I've been a doula, I have never heard an NHS midwife say that before. So it was really interesting to see the changes there, as well as just for our participants.
I'm very excited to see your numbers get published, because it will help us have conversations that we've been having without any data for the last few months.
Yes.
So.
The free birth paper is already out there. It's open access, and in Women in Frontiers in Women in Global Health.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close because we're at 4 o'clock. So I'll just say thank you once again to our excellent speakers, Charlotte Faircloth, Mary Greenfield and Io Wahlberg. It's been really great to have everyone attend today. I've been delighted to see our participant list. We've had about 37 people online, which is really great because usually when we do online events, people subscribe and say they're going to come in and they don't come, but I think everyone's come, which is just really, really nice for us. And I look forward to us having future events, either if that's the kind of the Centre for Reproduction Research Seminar Series, the East Midlands Medical Sociology Group, MedSoc, the Human Reproduction Study Group as well, of course. I look forward to us having these events in the future, being reunited when we all want to and when we feel safe to do so. And so in the meantime, it's nice to see people's faces on the screens. And thank you ever so much to all our speakers for their excellent talks, for the questions that have been posed, and to the BSA for helping us set this up today. And I hope that we will be sharing these presentations, the recordings of them with you in due course. And so we'll have an opportunity to kind of revisit some of these things in our own time. So thank you for everyone. And I hope we'll have opportunity to keep in touch, see each other at other events now, online or face-to-face when we can do. So just thank you once again from myself and Cathy and everyone at the CRR.
Thanks a lot.
And hopefully we'll see each other soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.